Morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for your patience. I know that this has been a bit of a wait here to get going. I'm going to cut some of my remarks short so that we can really get to the heart of our program more quickly. I know that there are still some translation technical issues going on with many people hearing both the speaker and the translator at the same time. Hopefully those will be resolved soon. I don't think it's supposed to be like that. The second thing I'm seeing is some questions about audience members not seeing a mute button for themselves. Because this was set up as a webinar, I think that you just don't have a mute button. We can't hear anybody. I haven't heard anybody from the audience, so I don't think you need to worry about that. So all of that said, first of all, thank you again to Miranda, my colleague Miranda, for all of her hard work on this event, getting the translation in order as best we possibly can. And thank you to all of you who have joined us this afternoon for this parallel event, Violence Against Indigenous Women, Brazil, Guatemala, and the United States. My name is Chris Foley. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation here in the United States, and I'm a senior attorney at the Indian Law Resource Center in Helena, Montana. I want to give a couple of quick notes to you. First of all, I would invite you to please look over in the document section for the event page. We've posted a few things in there that will be helpful to you. One is a program with biographies of the speakers and some information about the organizations that we work for. We want to spend our time talking to you today and not introducing each other. So I'm going to leave you to look at the program on your own time as we go along to find out who we are and where we're coming from. We've also posted a few other materials there that I think would be helpful. One is a copy of a magazine that some of the organizations in the United States put out called Restoration. There's a link to that magazine there. I think that my colleague Paula will talk more about that soon. I've also posted a copy of the recommendation that we've all come together with to make to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. And that recommendation, that's the part of the speech that I'll go ahead and give you today. As you're going to hear today, Indigenous women's rights intersect with a wide range of issues. It intersects with questions about development and land rights, environmental and health rights, human rights, civil rights, and political rights. And it intersects with our Indigenous rights of self-government and our Indigenous rights to our lands. Because this is such a deep and complex issue, I think that it's important that the UN Commission on the Status of Women continue to focus on this specific topic in a serious way. And that's why our recommendation is for the UN-CSW to continue and deepen its engagement with Indigenous women and their rights, including at its earliest opportunity by designating implementing Indigenous women's individual and collective rights to lives free of violence and discrimination as a focus area. So we'd like to have the UN-CSW name this as a focus area at an upcoming session in one of the near years. And that would allow us to have a half-day panel discussion at the UN with a series of leaders from around the world to talk about this issue, to educate the CSW and member states about some of the topics that we're going to talk more about today. So that's our recommendation. And we hope that perhaps some of you will consider supporting that, making that known in your advocacy as you go on. That's the substantive part that I'm going to do today, since we're so short on time at this point. I hope that you'll all stay and listen to some of the stories about the progress that we're making, about how Indigenous women and Indigenous organizations are engaging with our governments in Brazil and Guatemala and the United States in various ways to implement international standards that we have from Beijing, that we have from the human rights treaties, that we have from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, how we're working to improve the domestic laws that are holding us back, and to obtain the resources that we need to implement the solutions that we know will work for our communities. Indigenous peoples will work in our communities. We know it will work in our lands. We know it will work for our families. And we need support from our countries, our member states that we're a part of, and from the international community to make sure that we get the resources and the tools that we need to implement those solutions. So with that, that's all I'm going to say today. I'm going to turn this over to our partners from Brazil, beginning with Judith Guajajara, from the Coordination of the Indigenous Organizations in the Brazilian Amazon. Judith?
Obrigada, Cris. Obrigada. Eu sou Cari Guajajara, mas nome em português Judith Guajajara. Sou do povo Guajajara, do Maranhão, no Brasil. Sou advogada e sou membro da COIAB, Coordenação das Organizações Indígenas da Amazônia Brasileira. né? Eu cumprimento a todos os presentes, desejando boas-vindas e agradecendo a disposição em partilhar essa tarde conosco, principalmente para tratar de um tema que ainda é muito caro para vários países, a exemplo do Brasil. Como eu falei, eu sou membro da COIAB, né, que é a Coordenação das Organizações Indígenas da Amazônia Brasileira, é a maior organização indígena regional do Brasil, e nós estamos focados em trabalhar os direitos dos povos indígenas à terra, ao meio ambiente, à saúde, à educação, cultura e autodeterminação. Entre nós também estão os povos. Trabalhamos na luta pela proteção e reconhecimento dos povos indígenas que vivem em isolamento voluntário e os povos indígenas de recente contato. Nós mobilizamos hoje pelo menos 160 povos indígenas distintos no Brasil, o que representa cerca de 60% da população indígena, né, do país, e nós estamos, pelo menos, em 9 estados brasileiros, que é o Amazonas, o Tocantins, o Amapá, Maranhão, Rondônia, Acre, Pará, Roraima e Mato Grosso. Nós, a COIAB, né, ela é membro da coordenação das organizações indígenas da Bacia Amazônica, né, uma das maiores organizações indígenas do mundo, né, e também de representação internacional, e também é membro da Articulação dos Povos Indígenas do Brasil, a APIB, que é a maior organização indígena do Brasil. A COIAB foi a primeira organização indígena brasileira a ter um departamento específico de mulheres, hoje coordenada também por uma mulher indígena, que é a Nara Baré. Hoje ela é a coordenadora da COIAB, e nós temos como um dos nossos fundamentos de trabalho a defesa dos direitos das mulheres indígenas. Isso principalmente considerando a realidade extremamente desafiadora, né? Que, historicamente, grande parte das violências praticadas contra nós, povos indígenas, principalmente desencadeada por motivações étnicas, elas recaem especificamente sobre nós, mulheres indígenas, que por muito tempo fomos utilizadas como meio de consumar os atos de violência contra as nossas vidas, dos nossos povos e de nossas culturas. Então, o principal desafio em lidar com a violação dos direitos das mulheres indígenas no Brasil ainda é romper com o processo do próprio reconhecimento da nossa existência enquanto categoria específica. Existem processos de generalização que são empreendidos historicamente contra nossos povos, principalmente focados no processo de homogeneizar as nossas identidades e apagar a nossa diversidade. E isso refletiu diretamente sobre as especificidades estruturais internas, sobre as nossas classificações internas, nossas categorias internas. Então, para reconhecer o contexto em que se insere hoje as mulheres indígenas, é indispensável que antes a gente supere o panorama em que foi traçado, né, em que nós somos alocadas, sobre 2 perspectivas principais, né, no âmbito da relação com o Estado, que ora nós somos incluídas como mulheres, como grupo universal de mulheres, e ora nós somos incluídas como grupo universal de povos indígenas, o que silencia a interseccionalidade de gênero e etnia, que são sobrepostas, né, e que são necessárias para conseguir mencionar o mínimo da realidade em que nós vivemos, né? Nós lidamos com vulnerabilizações que vão desde compreender a nossa diferença identitária, que são invisíveis aos aspectos do tratamento universal de gênero, né, que é uma realidade que se traduz principalmente por não ser aplicável grande parte das políticas e normas que são ditas específicas para as mulheres. Então, as leis brasileiras que são criadas para as mulheres de forma universal, via de regra, elas não se aplicam à realidade das mulheres indígenas. Isso considerando que, dentro de diversas situações, ela não foi construída com a nossa participação, não tem uma construção coletiva, né? E aí elas acabam tendo estruturas técnicas, né, essenciais à sua execução, que não existem nas nossas comunidades, né? Então, existe um limite de acessibilidade dessa legislação, dessas políticas que são criadas de forma universal para o contexto universal de mulheres. né? De outra parte, a realidade das mulheres indígenas, quando transportada para um enquadramento da nossa coletividade étnica, a gente acaba representando um subconjunto dentro de um conjunto maior que são nossos povos. E grande parte do que seriam problemas específicos, né, de gênero, isso não é levado em consideração. Então, são destinadas ou políticas para mulheres num contexto universal ou políticas para povos indígenas em um contexto universal, fazendo com que a mulher indígena tenha que escolher entre ou ser mulher ou ser indígena, e não é considerado a interseccionalidade de gênero e etnia que nos afirma enquanto mulheres indígenas. E isso acaba limitando a autonomia de nossa determinação, né? Bem como a própria incidência na construção de políticas indigenistas que sejam amplas e diversas, para dar espaço para a própria expressão do que nós pensamos como políticas públicas. Ora, se nem mesmo se consegue nomear a nossa realidade enquanto categoria específica, sequer serão pensadas melhorias para um recorte que segue hoje no Brasil invisível. Né? As políticas e os marcos normativos indigenistas, eles foram construídos sem a intersecção de gênero e etnia, o que acaba alimentando um processo de invisibilização mesmo, né? Que já é historicamente arraigado aí à realidade dos povos indígenas no Brasil. E a COIAB, ela tem trabalhado muito para provocar uma ruptura nesses processos de silenciamento e visibilização, né, que assolam as nossas existências, as nossas demandas, e tem lutado principalmente para reforçar essa necessidade de reconhecimento de que, independentemente da nossa cultura, a violência e as violações de gênero, ela é injustificável. Né? E essa atuação da COIAB é justamente para provocar o Estado a atuar, né, sobre a violação de direitos fundamentais, porque mulheres indígenas hoje, em suas agências políticas, no movimento político indígena, têm se posicionado no sentido de dizer que nós estamos na linha de frente de resistência junto aos nossos povos para garantir a execução de nossos direitos coletivos. No entanto, nós também afirmamos, né, que existem violações específicas de gênero, existem violações que são específicas da nossa interseccionalidade, de mulheres indígenas, né, dessa interseccionalidade que agrega tanto gênero como etnia. E, assim, em um quadro exemplificativo, não bastasse nós lidarmos com violações como reintegrações de posse, invasões, explorações ilegais de madeiras e garimpos ilegais, nós, mulheres indígenas, as pesquisas demonstram no Brasil que nós somos alvos dessas violências gerais contra nossos povos, né? Violações ao território e a própria garantia ao território, que hoje o Brasil tem um processo de ataque que parte do próprio Estado com relação à garantia do direito ao território, isso representa uma das principais violências contra nós, mulheres indígenas. Então, nós estamos buscando os espaços para dizer que o direito à violação ao território é também uma violação de gênero, é uma violação de gênero porque violenta diretamente nós, mulheres indígenas, né? Então, considerando que todo esse processo de violência ele é estratégico para desmoralizar as nossas comunidades e até mesmo instigar limpezas étnicas, a necessidade de um tratamento específico, ele se torna ainda mais urgente. Sobre nós recai todas essas violências cometidas pelos nossos povos, mas elas são potencializadas por violências específicas também, como as ameaças dos jagunços que invadem nossos territórios, os assédios dos garimpeiros, as contaminações pelo mercúrio e outros químicos nos garimpos ilegais que nos atingem diretamente, e todas essas situações acabam vulnerabilizando de forma específica, nos vulnerabilizando de forma específica, tanto social quanto culturalmente, porque também elas trazem alterações, né, e desestruturações para dentro dos nossos territórios, para dentro das nossas formas organizativas. Então, nós, mulheres indígenas no Brasil, ainda vivemos, ainda lidamos com a utilização dos nossos corpos como alvo da violência que é direcionada aos nossos povos. As nossas organizações indígenas hoje são compostas de forma paritária, né? Tanto mulheres indígenas quanto homens indígenas, né? A gente obedecendo a questão geracional também, e nós só conquistamos isso porque nós, povos indígenas do Brasil, conquistamos o direito de existir com uma Constituição recente, a Constituição de 1988, porque até então nós não tínhamos o direito de existir enquanto povos indígenas, nós éramos considerados uma condição transitória. Com essa conquista, nós passamos a ter uma possibilidade de ampliar a percepção sobre nossos povos e nossas comunidades, destacando principalmente que nós somos povos complexos, povos completos, né, que têm línguas próprias, culturas próprias, sistemas religiosos, econômicos específicos. E dentro de toda essa nossa organização social, nós também temos as nossas categorias. Não podemos ser tratados de forma universal e não se considerar a diversidade que existem dentro dos nossos territórios, porque essa própria universalização, ela é uma estratégia, né? Uma estratégia de nos silenciar e tornar ainda mais cômodo toda a violência que é praticada sobre nós. Ora, se nós não conseguimos, né, fazer com que o Estado nos reconheça enquanto sujeito de direitos, como nós poderemos pensar em dados que exemplifiquem todo o processo de violência que nós sofremos, toda a necessidade de legislações e políticas específicas que nós necessitamos. Mas, graças à atuação do movimento indígena no Brasil, das agências políticas indigenistas, nós temos conseguido ocupar espaços de poder, temos conseguido ocupar cargos no âmbito público e dentro da própria linha de frente do movimento indígena, conseguindo trazer à tona essa discussão, tirando do lugar de silenciamento essa situação e dando voz, né, às nossas realidades e também às nossas especificações. Então, de forma geral, é isso que nós enfrentamos no Brasil hoje. Ainda lutamos contra diretrizes básicas para que a gente possa afirmar o nosso direito de existência de forma específica, e nós, da coordenação das organizações indígenas da Amazônia brasileira, temos trabalhado fortemente para que os direitos das mulheres indígenas sejam reconhecidos e sejam reconhecidos também a fundamentalidade dos direitos indígenas. Então, esse é um panorama geral. Agradeço o espaço, vou passar agora para a Cris, que é advogada indígena também do Brasil, que vai continuar a explanação.
Boa tarde a todos. Todos estão me ouvindo? Então, eu sou a Cristiane do Povo Baré, também sou advogada indígena, atualmente prestando assessoria da coordenação das organizações indígenas da COIAB, e eu vou, no caso do prosseguimento do que já foi falado pela Caricó Jajá, em relação à situação de vulnerabilidade das mulheres indígenas no Brasil, em relação à pandemia Covid-19. Então, como já se percebeu, as mulheres elas podem ser consideradas o grupo social mais afetado pela pandemia do coronavírus, principalmente quando se fala em impacto econômico. E dentro desse grupo é ainda maior risco de vulnerabilidade de mulheres indígenas. Por que isso, a gente se pergunta? Porque a maioria das mulheres, né, esse grupo social que estão, elas não têm empregos fixos, os empregos delas são precários, são empregos informais. Muitas vezes as mulheres indígenas, né, vivem da vida do seu artesanato, né, elas produzem dentro das suas comunidades. Então, com a situação agravante do coronavírus aqui no Brasil, e com necessidade de se manter no isolamento, muitas mulheres não puderam mais sair, né, para estar fazendo a vida nesses artesanatos. E isso, o que acaba acontecendo? O dinheiro não entra mais dentro das comunidades, dos lares. E aí, justamente, vem aquela questão. Elas, muitas vezes, são chefes de famílias indígenas, né? São elas que dão todo esse apoio para os homens dentro das suas comunidades. Elas são responsáveis pelo sustento, né? Tanto dos filhos como até de outros familiares dentro das suas comunidades. E aí, muitas vezes, vivendo dessa venda de artesanato, ou com algumas serviços de aposentadoria, ou trabalhos domésticos prestados fora das suas comunidades, isso acabou realmente agravando a situação da violência dentro das comunidades, porque a mulher ela passou a conviver mais com o seu agressor dentro da sua comunidade. Ela não via mais esse lar, vamos dizer assim, como um local de acolhimento, de aconchego, porque muitas vezes esse agressor ele está dentro desse lar, dessa comunidade. Então, além de pensar de ter o que comer, elas enfrentam a batalha de fazer a casa funcionar. Então, essa é uma extensão de estresse, né? E a gente acompanha atualmente que, antes da quarentena, essas indígenas, que eram artesãos, né? Elas tinham uma situação, dentro de outras profissões, elas vendiam mais produtos, então elas tinham mais condições de levar esse alimento para dentro de casa. E hoje, infelizmente, com a situação da pandemia, né, para estar gravada, elas não têm mais condições de sair para estar vendendo seu artesanato. Fora toda essa situação, com a Covid-19, nós tivemos o maior aumento de invasões de terras indígenas, né, como a Cari já colocou, a questão do garimpo ilegal, né, a questão de tirar madeiras ilegalmente, desmatamento. E todas essas situações, elas agravam a violência dentro dos territórios indígenas. Né? A gente pode ver aqui o abuso de álcool dentro das comunidades, né? A situação econômica que ela é desfavorável, infelizmente. Isso abala as premissas de masculinidade a partir do desemprego ou da diminuição da renda em decorrência da pandemia. Soma-se essa situação ao fato do governo não ter um plano de enfrentamento para a pandemia-19 junto aos povos indígenas aqui no Brasil e vão respeitar as suas especificidades culturais. Então, essa é a situação que nós estamos vivendo no Brasil, inclusive sobre casos de subnotificações, né? Nós não temos dados concretos, corretos, sobre quantos indígenas, digo assim, dados oficiais, quantos indígenas morreram com Covid. Nós temos os dados que são apresentados pelas comunidades, pelas organizações indígenas, como a PIB, a própria CONIAB, uma vez que há um órgão responsável aqui no Brasil, ele não considera o indígena que não vive dentro da aldeia, né? O indígena urbano, que é chamado. Então, esses indígenas que vieram morrer fora desses territórios, eles não são alocados, esses dados não são colocados oficialmente dentro da Secretaria de Saúde Indígena. Então, são os casos de subnotificação que nós temos os povos indígenas no Brasil bem sofrendo. Então, e aí, essa chegada da quarentena com a pandemia, a gente vê que as mulheres tiveram, vamos dizer assim, estar mais próximas, como eu já falei, dos seus agressores, né? E esse aumento de violência, desde que se iniciou esse isolamento social. Tá? E o que a gente coloca também é assim, que além disso, quem tem o aumento das tensões dentro de casa, né? Por causa desse isolamento das mulheres, muitas mulheres sofrem as agressões e elas não têm, como a Karen disse, o acesso para fazer as denúncias. Muitas vezes, até pela questão cultural mesmo, mas com medo de perder pouquinho. O agressor, muitas vezes, é o marido, é o companheiro, é o irmão, e muitas vezes essas mulheres, elas vivem, vamos dizer assim, elas precisam do apoio financeiro desses agressores. E aí, então, por isso, muitas não procuram ajuda, né? Além dessa falta de acesso à legislação, falta de conhecimento, né? Porque seja a violência, ainda tem toda essa questão econômica, que ela tem o medo de perder o apoio de e não conseguia se manter. Então, fora toda essa questão da pandemia, que não gerou só a questão da doença, mas toda a violência ao ambiente dos povos indígenas, a gente, além de todas as violências, nós vamos verificar que houve outros tipos de violações que vêm justamente do agravamento do sofrimento, da violência, né? Questão de depressão, da angústia, e outras situações, né? Porque o local, vamos dizer assim, da sua casa, que era para ter segurança, é o lugar que está mais vulnerável neste momento, né? E aí, justamente, junta-se a luta do movimento indígena contra essas discriminações, contra esses preconceitos, né? A luta de proteção do meio ambiente, porque o que deve estar muito claro é que as populações indígenas, elas não são seres isolados, elas são seres coletivos. Nós, como indígenas, somos coletivos. Então, tudo tem que estar interligado. Nós temos que estar bem na comunidade, no nosso ambiente, nos nossos territórios, para que justamente, de alguma forma, a gente tente combater essas violências que as mulheres indígenas vêm sofrendo no país, né? Então, a luta do movimento indígena é justamente contra essas discriminações, contra esses preconceitos. E a COIAB, ultimamente, tem tido muito interesse em estar dando esse apoio para as nossas mulheres indígenas, tanto em relação à questão da formação, de levar a informação do que é certo e do que é errado. Muitas vezes batemos com as culturas de cada povo, é diferente no Brasil, nós não somos todos iguais, então cada um tem a sua especificidade, cada um tem a sua forma de ver o que é a violência, e a gente tentar respeitar e levar justamente para essas organizações, para essas mulheres, de que forma nós podemos combater a violência. Então, eu acho que a grande luta do movimento é justamente isso, romper esses paradigmas, né? Que a mulher e o homem, todos os dois são importantes, sim. E a violência, ela não faz parte da nossa cultura, dos nossos territórios. Eu acredito por aqui. Se houver alguma pergunta, se a Karen quiser também ainda completar, nós estamos à disposição. Obrigada, gente. Boa tarde.
Thank you all. I think next we're going to turn to the discussion about Guatemala from International Maya League and Juanita and Lisa. Thank you.
Buen día para todas y todos. Primeramente quiero agradecer al corazón del cielo, corazón de la madre tierra, corazón del aire, corazón del agua, que precisamente hoy también es su día, de tenernos reunidos en esta oportunidad y en este espacio. De la misma manera quisiera agradecer a las energías de nuestras grandes abuelas y abuelos, que seguramente llegaron antes que nosotros llegáramos a este espacio, para que realmente nos acompañen y que nos transmiten esas energías de resistencia y de lucha que históricamente lo tuvieron. De la misma manera, según nuestro calendario maya, pues hoy nos marca el Jun'aj. También quisiera relacionar con todas las personas que nacen en este día, pues son personas que les gusta compartir, les gusta intercambiar sus conocimientos y experiencias, y creo que es lo que estamos construyendo en este preciso momento y en este preciso espacio. Pues en esta oportunidad se me ha pedido compartir con ustedes sobre la situación de las mujeres mayas en Guatemala en cuanto a la violencia, racismo y colonización. Quisiera como remarcar diciendo que desde la colonia pues nos dejó ahí sí que varias situaciones muy críticos, ¿no? Desde el momento en que los pueblos fueron sometidos, desde que los pueblos fueron ahí sí que azotados de un sistema de vida diferente a la suya. En este caso quisiera remarcar cómo y en qué momento no se les impusieron un modelo de vida muy diferente a lo que nosotros históricamente lo teníamos como pueblos originarios. En este sentido, pues el modelo económico, el modelo político, el modelo de una vida social y cultural, pues realmente se enfocó en un desarrollo dominante e histórico. Creo que ustedes lo saben más que quizás mi persona, pero también tiene cierta coincidencia, ¿verdad?, con toda la lucha histórica de América Latina. Y que a partir de ahí quisiera remarcar cómo fuimos vistas nosotras como pueblos originarios. Quisiera partir de ahí, cómo fueron vistos nuestros grandes abuelos y abuelas, como obreras, como sumisas, como calladas, como personas sin sentido, como personas como personas objetos, ¿no? Y ser utilizado como mano de obras baratas, y sobre todo hacer de las suyas, de los grandes poderosos en ese entonces, o los grandes capitalistas, ¿no?, que intervinieron en ese momento a despojarnos de lo que históricamente nos corresponde como hijas, nietos y nietas de estos grandes territorios. Realmente quisiera remarcar entonces cómo quedaron los pueblos, hasta dónde y a qué extremo llegamos nosotros con el simple hecho de decirnos que nuestra forma de organización no tenía ningún sentido, que nuestra forma de hacer gobierno comunitario, si es que es con ese nombre se le puede llamar, no tenía ningún sentido. Teníamos un legado histórico desde nuestros conocimientos y saberes como hijos e hijas de nuestros ancestros. También se nos dijo que eso no tenía ningún sentido. Teníamos nuestra forma de relacionarnos con la madre tierra y cómo nosotros nos proyectábamos en ese momento, ¿no? También se nos dijo, teníamos un legado histórico de nuestros grandes libros y saberes desde nuestros tejidos, desde nuestros artes, desde nuestra música. También se nos dijo que ya no tenía ningún sentido. Se vino entonces una imposición que hoy por hoy sigue impregnada en todo el sistema del Estado guatemalteco. Hoy por hoy quisiera como mencionar entonces qué significó esa ruptura de esa forma de organización y el sometimiento para los pueblos. Levantar nuevamente nuestra lucha y nuestra resistencia, que aún existe y está presente, es muy difícil ante todo un sistema de colonización hace más ya de 500 años y que está impregnado en todos los sistemas del Estado. Lo que pesa, lo que va a significar para los pueblos y luego para las mujeres, en este caso las mujeres del pueblo maya. Por lo tanto, esa violencia que se vivió, ¿verdad?, ahí sí que la vida de los pueblos, hoy por hoy lo vemos en el sistema educativo que ha sido un instrumento de dominación, en el sistema educativo donde perdió totalmente su sentido en responder una educación con pertinencia cultural. Hoy por hoy también lo estamos viendo, cómo se distorsionó la visión y la mirada de los grandes abuelos y abuelas en cuanto a la transmisión de los conocimientos y saberes de generación a generación. Por el simple hecho, por ejemplo, cómo nos están viendo a nosotros en un sistema educativo sin tener esa oportunidad, sin tener ese acceso para llegar ahí sí que a discutir y a plantear un nuevo sistema, un nuevo paradigma para el sistema educativo a nivel nacional, rompiendo con todos esos prejuicios de racismo y discriminación que históricamente se nos han impuesto. También, ¿cómo podemos ver esa imposición en el sistema de salud? Cuando hoy por hoy, con el tiempo de COVID, pues pudimos ver los grandes conocimientos y saberes de nuestros abuelos y que anteriormente esto no era visible ni tampoco era tan importante ni es tan importante para el sistema el sistema de salud. ¿Por qué no mencionar también el sistema de justicia? cómo se maneja, cómo se aplica, quiénes son las beneficiarias de este sistema de justicia occidental. Nos dimos cuenta un caso recientemente en Guatemala, una compañera que supuestamente robó un alicate de Energuat, que es el que brinda el servicio de energía eléctrica en Guatemala. Fue acusada para 3 años de cárcel, mientras que a los grandes millonarios, pues ahí sí que suele pasar, ¿no? Que la justicia está a favor de ellos y de ellas. Entonces, en este sentido, quienes carga con toda esa experiencia, quienes carga con esos grandes saberes y las grandes resistencias, somos nosotros las mujeres mayas en Guatemala. Quisiera mencionar también cómo se vive la violencia en la actualidad también en las mujeres, y que realmente es muy interesante hacerlo mención en esta época, durante la llegada de la pandemia del COVID, que hizo visible las desigualdades que históricamente se ha vivido. ¿Cómo es tan importante visualizar en dónde están quedando las grandes ayudas del Estado? ¿Cómo es tan visible seguir como rescatando esa manera de operar a través de sus instituciones del Estado con un prejuicio de racismo y discriminación, viendo a los pueblos originarios y principalmente a las mujeres como objeto de cooptación de recursos, pero también de malversación de fondos? Y esto es tan importante como ir mencionándolo dentro de este análisis, ¿no? También es tan importante ir viendo cómo se están dando los casos de femicidio actualmente. Quizás históricamente las mujeres sufrieron ya la violencia en carne propia, y que desde la vida, desde la llegada a la colonia, desde la colonia, pues también se invisibilizó su aporte y su participación en las diferentes esferas de la vida política, sobre todo de este país. Pero también como hoy por hoy están como que retomando nuevamente, ¿verdad?, cómo se está viviendo el femicidio, pero también cómo se están viendo el asesinato fuertemente hacia las mujeres. Yo quisiera resaltar hoy por hoy que si puede ser una distracción a nivel nacional con tal de apagar y opacar las diferentes luchas históricas de las mujeres para defender sus derechos individuales y colectivos, pero si ustedes pudieran ver las noticias en Guatemala, realmente hay mujeres desaparecidas, ¿verdad? Ahí sí que constantemente, con tal de meter el miedo, pero también eso tiene una explicación, ¿no? También ahí sí que desde cómo nuevamente las estrategias del miedo, del temor, se está infiltrando nuevamente en las luchas de los movimientos sociales que se vive en el país. También quisiera mencionar en este contexto, ¿verdad?, en breve intervención, cómo se da el tema de la migración, cómo se vive el tema de la migración en Guatemala. Es tan lamentable que jovencitas, señoritas de 15 años se están inmigrando constantemente a Estados Unidos. ¿Cómo es que también ellas, a pesar de lo poco que tienen los padres de familia, quizás tienen algunos bienes, algunos ahorro, por ahí sí que pudiera servir para cubrir los gastos a nivel familiar, pero con esto también pudiera mencionar que lo que hacen es como sacar un préstamo más de la cuenta y dejando en riesgo los bienes, los pocos bienes que tienen las familias para viajar. Mínimamente un costo de 75,000 a 150,000 son los costos que está, ahí sí que lo que está costando la llegada de los hermanos allá en los Estados Unidos. ¿Qué implica esto entonces? También hay otra doble recarga u otro triple rol que debe jugar la mujer dentro del hogar. Aparte de que debe ser madre de familia, pero también juega un papel que ser padre. Y también cuidar lo poquito que tienen a nivel de las comunidades. En este caso, también las mujeres asumen otro compromiso más frente a una situación muy crítica que se vive a nivel de nuestro país. Cabalmente nosotros, donde apoyamos procesos organizativos para las mujeres, nos contaba, ahora nos toca enfrentar no solo la discriminación, el racismo que se ha vivido históricamente, también nos toca ahí sí que enfrentar la ola de violencia que se vive a nivel nacional, sobre todo en el tema de las extorsiones. Es tan increíble cómo las mujeres tengan que enfrentar esta ola de violencia que se vive a nivel nacional, mientras que mientras que el gobierno de alguna manera invisibiliza ese aporte que los hermanos de Estados Unidos dan para fortalecer la economía a nivel nacional. Entonces, en este sentido, es tan importante cómo también las mujeres se están enfrentando frente a esta situación que es muy difícil y crítico para enfrentar. De la misma manera, es tan importante mencionar hoy por hoy la llegada de las empresas transnacionales que siguen. Ellos sí no dejaron de operar durante el tiempo de pandemia. Ellos sí están libres, siguieron operando, pero también los nuevos despojos de las tierras que se están dando, ahí sí que, por ejemplo, en Alta Verapaz, ¿verdad? Con la situación de la palma aceitera. Cómo es que se están haciendo despojadas las mujeres, ahí sí que enfrentando a carne propia, ¿verdad? Ahí sí que una situación de violencia. Y esto para nosotros también ha sido un tema muy importante y muy, ahí sí que interesante, ¿no? De abordarlo a estos espacios, porque posiblemente tenemos temas muy comunes que donde pudiéramos como ir analizando y al mismo tiempo retomando como un punto de partida de nuestra lucha histórica de las mujeres. En este caso, es tan importante entonces ir viendo el tema de la criminalización, el tema de los despojos que sufren las mujeres desde sus comunidades, cómo ellos pues, también se siguen como enfrentando ante esta situación. Otro de los puntos muy importantes que quisiera abordar en esto es también los mínimos esfuerzos que se están germinando, ¿verdad? Ahí sí que yo quisiera como hacer relevancia el papel que ha jugado los jóvenes, mujeres mayas de Guatemala a través de la música, del arte, de la poesía, pues también están expresando, ¿verdad?, su pronunciamiento en contra de estas injusticias. Quisiera como también eso mencionarlo, porque también cómo se están heredando ahí sí que las luchas históricas en las nuevas generaciones. También quisiera como recalcar los esfuerzos mínimos que han hecho las organizaciones de mujeres mayas a nivel nacional. También están luchando constantemente para que se reconozca y se reivindique el derecho individual y colectivo de los pueblos en Guatemala. Es una lucha constante, porque los despojos inclusive no solo está para despojar las tierras, también para despojarnos de nuestros grandes conocimientos que nos dejaron nuestros ancestros. No digamos así, en nuestros conocimientos, en la aplicación y el uso de la medicina natural. No digamos así el conocimiento que nosotros hemos portado en el tejido de elaborar nuestras propias indumentarias mayas que son históricas y que son nuestra segunda piel, como lo dicen nuestras hermanas mayas aquí en Guatemala, pero también son nuestros sagrados libros. También hay una lucha constante ahí. Entonces yo como que quisiera unificar estas luchas, ¿verdad?, que son tan importantes para ir reconociendo cómo estamos avanzando en la defensa de nuestras luchas. Pero también quisiera recalcar que hubieron esfuerzos anteriores para abrir ciertas ventanas de participación para las mujeres dentro del sistema del Estado. Y aquí quisiera mencionar una de ellas, que es la Defensoría de la Mujer Indígena en Guatemala, la DEMI, ¿verdad? Es una ventanilla que se aperturó en su momento con mucho esfuerzo, con mucha lucha de las mujeres, pero hoy por hoy, ¿qué hay de esta lucha? También eso es muy importante mencionarlo porque ha sido un esfuerzo histórico y que, por supuesto, es muy importante que también han utilizado los instrumentos internacionales para que realmente se respalde su lucha a nivel nacional. Así que muchísimas gracias. Quisiera dejar también el espacio a Juanita para que continúe con esta participación.
Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. I'm greeting you from Piscataway Nation. I will be sharing a couple of slides. So let me get on to share screen. As my colleague and sister from the Hmong people has just been discussing, and I believe you can see my slides now on the screen. She was discussing some of the key factors of how Indigenous Maya women are affected in Guatemala. And my part of the presentation is on what those impacts are in relation to mobility, forced migration, and migration routes. And specifically discussing the particular situation that Indigenous women in migration are facing because of their Indigenous identity. So as she had been discussing, here is our territory in Guatemala, and we are 22 distinct Maya nations. All throughout Guatemala, we're an Indigenous majority people. And as the last pieces of the presentation had alluded to, we have an influx of transnational corporations and development models that have been imposed on our lands and territories, along with extreme inequalities. And the ones who are the most affected by these inequalities are the Indigenous majority. And so here we have our Indigenous nations and peoples, but then on this side of the screen, 1 through 13, we see the migration patterns of Indigenous nations and some of the largest Indigenous peoples who are now going through Mexico and coming up to the United States. So my particular focus will be on what's been happening at the border rather than what happens at the border and then into the interior. This data comes from our partner at the border through Casalitas, which is also a program through Catholic Charities. And they are the only Indigenous language Indigenous organization in the entire border. And this data reflects the intake of families that have been coming through. And as you'll see from 2017 through 2019, there's been a total of over 6,000 Indigenous migrants, and most of them, the frequency of them speaking an Indigenous language is at 39%. And you see here it's about 35% female. And so what this means in terms of the language patterns in the last couple of years, we have now an increasing number of Indigenous languages, Indigenous peoples that are present, not just from the Western Highlands, which was the historical trend from conflicts, war, genocide in Guatemala related to Indigenous peoples from the 1980s, but then now shifts in migration pattern due, of course, to longstanding conflicts on lands and territories, but also extreme poverty and inequalities that are affecting the Indigenous majority and that are a continuation or an outcome of more than 36 years of internal armed conflict, civil war, and genocide. And so in the last couple of years, really the migration patterns have started to shift, and so now it's an overall migration that's occurring from Guatemala to the United States border. From an Indigenous human rights perspective, specifically Indigenous women, as has been mentioned in some of the previous presentations, There is a particular nexus that Indigenous women face throughout any of the various human rights violations that we face because of our gender, because we're Indigenous, because of poverty, because of lack of education, and these are generalities. And so when it comes to Indigenous women who are fleeing from, crime or criminalization or abuse, violence, and they're going through the migration journey, they also experience a particular migration journey as opposed to Indigenous men because they are women or they are girls. In addition to this is the role of erasure of our Indigenous identity. When we come to the border, we are miscategorized often as Latino or Hispanic. We are no longer considered Native American Indigenous. And so the language vulnerability, language exclusion becomes another hindrance to the full enjoyment of our rights. So what that means is, particularly for the Violence Against Women Act that talks about victims of violent crimes, sexual assault, sex trafficking, for Indigenous women who many times often do not speak Spanish, they are not able to report any acts of violence or any situation that they have encountered at all or in a timely manner. And so this hinders their ability to relay information that's critical, perhaps to their asylum case, perhaps to an urgent medical need when they get to the border, because they're not able to communicate in Spanish. So for instance, other hardships that women have faced, and we went to the border and we interviewed women in 2019 to try to understand the scope of the number of Indigenous women who are coming to the border, again, because there's no disaggregated data, there's no information about Indigenous women and girls or Indigenous peoples in general in migration. And so what we found was really, it reflects what has come out of several other reports, that Indigenous women or women in general experience higher rates of sexual assault, abuse, potential rape, potential trafficking. And so these are some of the quotes that we were able to get. For instance, one woman who was traveling through Mexico had said that because she had an extremely heavy period, she felt that that was the reason why she was being prevented from being raped. Another woman in Tijuana, before she crossed into the United States, said that the mafia in Tijuana took away girls and women to sell them into prostitution. And there were numerous women who talked about being sexually harassed and documenting over and over their really having fear for their safety and personal security. Additionally, in recent reports, what we are finding is that there has been, of course, excessive use of force by Customs and Border Protection agents. And recently in 2020, the report that came out from Project South, which talked about forced sterilization of women in detention. And we've actually reached out to the lawyers for that situation, and we asked them if they have any data that might indicate how many of those women might be Indigenous. And so at this time, because there's no disaggregated data, there's no concrete information as to whether or not how vulnerable Indigenous women may be. But we know that there's greater vulnerability, especially since there's no disaggregated data that's coming out in terms of the documentation of human rights violations that's occurring at the border. And then, of course, as we look now into the US context and missing and murdered Indigenous women, also an epidemic, as Elisa had mentioned, with femicide rates in Guatemala against women. Though we may not use the term missing and murdered Indigenous women in Guatemala, it's the same type of situation that's occurring. This is one of the most noticeable cases that happened in 2018. Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez was shot in the head by a Customs and Border Patrol agent as she was crossing the border. Her case, unfortunately, continues to have no justice. It's still in limbo in the investigation. And even though there were multiple calls for a thorough investigation into her shooting and justice for those who killed her, there has not been a public report ever made about what had happened in this particular case. And so as we're seeing in migration, the human rights violations that cause us to leave our countries of origin and then go through this very treacherous migration journey to end up at the border, I think it really is important that as Indigenous women across the various countries of Abya Yala, or what is now known as the Americas, that we really figure out ways to join together regardless of borders, because the human rights violations that are particular for Indigenous women are happening to us regardless of which nation state we're in. And so these are just a couple of recommendations that we have called on the US. So of course, specifically, we are disappointed, though not surprised, that the United States and the special rapporteurs have not done an analysis at the border and migration within an Indigenous human rights framework. Again, this goes to the fact that we're misclassified, we're misunderstood as Hispanic or Latino and not Indigenous. And so therefore, when there has been any sort of reports and documentation and verification of human rights violations, really, it doesn't take into account Indigenous peoples. So we're asking that the United States extend an invitation special rapporteur specifically for the rights of Indigenous peoples. And then, of course, all of the other special rapporteurs on human rights, violence against women, to be able to do some sort of thorough investigation at what's been happening at the border. We continue to demand for some sort of report and transparency around the murder of Claudia Patricia Gomez Gonzalez. We also are working or feel that it's very critical that states work directly with Indigenous-led organizations, Indigenous peoples, to develop a process that would allow for human rights violations of women to be taken into account, and then to be able to formulate strategies. And then the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples did come out with a report in 2019 on Indigenous peoples and migration and a global framework. And so we do support their one recommendation at the end, which was to work specifically with Indigenous peoples and adopt better measures on disaggregated data on our identity, as well as issues of interpretation, language access, due process, with a particular focus on vulnerable communities, including women, children, and girls, disabilities, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex persons. And so really what we're calling attention is that oftentimes when we're looking at the situation in our countries of origin, we're looking at the conversation of migration as looking at the root drivers of forced migration as to why are so many of our people being forced to leave our ancestral lands? Why is there such a majority Indigenous people who are being unaccounted for and completely invisible? And to rethink and recenter the conversations around looking at those root drivers and then addressing from an Indigenous human rights framework some of those human rights violations that are occurring to us as we are forced to cross borders. So I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. I think we're going to move now to the United States. And I can't recall if we're starting with Alaska or are we starting with Carmen O'Leary down in the Great Plains?
I think you're starting with Alaska, and I'll keep it brief so that Carmen has time to talk as well. And thank you so much Good morning, afternoon, evening to some places. My name is Tammy Truitt-Giroux. I'm a citizen of the Anvik tribe in the interior of Alaska and an executive director for the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. I'm a mother, a grandmother, an auntie, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about the situation in our tribes and our communities. Sadly, a study from the National Institute of Justice in 2016 found that approximately 56% of Native women experience sexual violence within their lifetime, with 1 out of 7 of Native women experiencing it in the past year. Unfortunately, this study isn't an accurate study because when we've had other people testify over in different situations that actually it's more like 1 in 3 have experienced some kind of violence in their lifetime. This report confirms that many of us have already known. It also confirms that much of the work that we continue to remains to be done in the United States. The Alaska Native Women's Resource Center, since its inception, has been working one-on-one with various tribes to help organize and help develop tribal-specific responses that restores Alaska Native-specific protections for women rooted in Alaska Native-specific voices, languages, and teachings. We work with tribes to engage in annual government-to-government violence against women consultations, to share the barriers faced and recommendations for the federal change that meaningfully impacts tribes in their efforts to end the violence committed against women in their communities. These barriers are reflected in federal laws and policies that are slowly changing and improving, but has a long history of not respecting the right to self-determination of Indigenous peoples' governments. AK and WRC has worked with tribes to develop Alaska-specific platform for change. And one very specific effort that AK and WRC has been undertaken is to develop partnerships with Native organizations to break the isolation that Alaska tribes have often faced to help Alaska issues also become national concerns. Part of those efforts have been educate non-Native partners, state and national, to understand specific challenges for Alaska Native tribes and Native women, and also dialogue on solutions. A large part of the effort is to inform and educate lawmakers to understand the direct connection between federal law and policy that have harmed tribal nations and Native peoples, especially resulting in the disproportionate rates of violence against women. Part of the information and education is the annual government-to-government consultations and developing relationships with lawmakers in Washington, D.C. to help them be a part of fulfilling the trust obligations to tribal nations. According to the 2013 Tribal Law and Order Act Commission report, Alaska Native women are overrepresented in the domestic violence victim population by 250%. They comprise 19% of the state population and by our 47% reported rape victims. And among other Indian tribes, Alaska Native women suffer the highest rates of domestic and sexual violence in the country. These statistics may be over 7 years old, but unfortunately, true today. Our happening are visible in even more prominent positions within national organizations, in local, state, and federal leadership and government roles. There has been increased growth in Native organizations addressing violence against Native women and engaging with the federal policy change. The voices of Native women are getting louder and demanding change in systems that have contributed to and continue to sustain the violence perpetrated against Native women. And those voices are getting louder in demanding resources and other sustainable systems that help rid us of the violence and other victimization that continues to hurt Native women and their families. Replacing foreign violence are Native customs and traditions, old and new. And you can also reference the article in Restoration magazine, particularly about specifically to Alaska and the sexual abuse rates. And that's on page 71 of that Restoration magazine in the resources. And thank you so much. And I'd like to turn it over to Carmen.
I didn't expect you to be done that fast, Tammy. Hello, everyone. I'm not sure I can talk as fast as Tammy, but I wanted to start with that we, the Native Women's Society of the Great Plains, support the implementing the Indigenous women's individual and collective rights to live free of violence and discrimination as a focus area. I think that that is right on, especially after listening to everyone here today and knowing the issues in our area. A couple of the things that I wanted to talk about that we have been working on. Back in 2013, we gained the legislation that tribes were able to arrest non-Indian violators in intimate partner relationships. And that has been really difficult to implement. There's generations of not being able to do that. There's some costs that are prohibitive that keep many of our tribes from being able to do that. So that is still a problem. Like Tammy talked about, the government to government consultations, we're still asking for that, and that law is moving through our Congress and our Senate right now on this very day to be able to bring more accountability and justice to protect Native women in our communities. Some of the enhancements that we're asking for would include being able to charge perpetrators on their crimes against our children and the crimes against the officers, the Native officers that would be arresting them. In those situations, that is also another way that inhibits the true accountability for those perpetrators. So we will continue to talk to legislators and joining in each other, our domestic violence task force with the National Congress of American Indians, working with Indian Law Center, and working within our own tribal leaders groups to ask that the law be moved forward. Another area that we're working on is the oil lines and the pipelines that are coming through our area in the man camps. Here in South Dakota, they kind of had a backward response in that the federal government gave money to provide services to Native women who would be the victims of those man camps. There was no legislation to enhance anything or accountability on possible perpetrators. The only law that was passed was that if Native people or others protested the pipelines, that there would be enhancements against them to criminal enhancements if they were arrested during those protests. We continue to stay on these task force to guide and provide services and ask that these laws be changed. Our populations do not get any of the positive outcomes from this work. We are usually on the other end of that. So we know that globally, any of these industrial kind of things that are going on in Indigenous nations are never have good outcomes for Indigenous people, and that remains the same here in the Great Plains. The man camps don't come right on our tribal lands, and that's been a lot of protesting and a lot of movement, grassroots movement that has kept them off, but they don't move very far away. What else? And we're going to continue with the education on that. The good news right now is that the current administration has heard us. Those pipelines are indefinitely stopped, but it's kind of like waiting for the other shoe to drop. And so we need to stay focused. We need to keep our guard up, because that could come along at any time and be reestablished. The infrastructure is there. The other thing I really wanted to talk about, which is a growing crisis in our area, is the incarceration of Native women in the prison system. I don't have the federal numbers. I know that they are high. Here in the state of South Dakota, at the end of February, the Native women incarcerated in the state's prisons is at 52%. The majority of their crimes are low-level drug crimes and a lot of crimes of poverty, just not having the money to pay a small fine and then getting put on probation and being seen as a bail jumper. It's like it just snowballs. And you know, the long-term effects of that are going to be horrendous. You know, these young women are being taken away from their children. When they get out, they're at less than ground zero because they don't have a ID, they don't have a home. Many of them are returning to abuse situations or shelters. They're not able to get their children back, very little support. And so they're put in a position of less than zero than where they started from. So some of the things that we want to start looking at is rehabilitation, asking our tribes to do more to help women coming back out of that system, and to start researching the discrimination because of the discrepancy in the sentencing, you know, with the same crime, what happens to Native people as opposed to non-Indians. Even as I was writing this yesterday and the day before, there was a lot of, one of the top news stories was the murder of some young Asian women. And, you know, it was definitely a hate crime, however anyone wants to talk about that. But with Native women, there was a target put on Native women in this country back when the wars were going on. And I think that target remains. We want to do what we can to provide resources to back Indigenous people, to respond to the crises, and to build our communities back to health and prosperity. We have successes around these issues that can't be measured, in that there's a lot of violence reduction. The success is that we're saying that it's happening. You know, that voice hasn't been here for very long. We can raise more statistics. We're more aware of how to gather those. And I think that, you know, we are going to continue to address and identify the issues that keep Native women unsafe through all of the systematic structures that are built that do just that. We really have to continue to look at that and identify those areas so that we can change the policies and the laws that continue to make our area unsafe for Native people in general and Native women specifically. So thank you all for listening, and wishing you all a day of peace and safety.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for those good words. Thank you to all of our presenters thus far. If there are any questions from the audience, feel free to put them in the chat function, and we will see if we can address them. In the meantime, I'm going to turn it back over to my friend Paula Julian at NIWRC to go ahead with some closing remarks, and then if there's questions, we'll circle back to those after that. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Can you hear me now? Okay. So I just want to take the time to thank all of our speakers from Brazil, from the International Mayan League, and from Native sisters here in the United States. Listening to all 6 of our awesome women leaders really brings home what all 6 of them have been saying, that Indigenous women know all too well for too long, that government-sanctioned violence reflected in government laws in Brazil, in Guatemala, and in the United States is very much the reason behind the violence that Indigenous women experience in the different countries. And that government-sanctioned violence, whether it be directly by government agencies such as Border Patrol or federal law enforcement, or from government-sanctioned organizations like corporations, transnational corporations, extractive industries, even churches, that at the end of the day, those government agencies and government-supported organizations must be held accountable. And I think of the words of a mother of a murdered Native woman out of South Dakota who told us that we are way past the point of raising awareness. This has been, I think, as Eliza shared, this has been going on for 500, if not longer, 500 years. So this is, if governments are not aware or societies are not aware, then what else has to change in order to raise that awareness so that as a result of the awareness, we have action? Native women and girls, we can't afford to lose anymore. So I think hearing Juanita talk about the young woman who was murdered in 2018 by US Border Patrol and still no action, no accountability. What does that say to Indigenous women worldwide? We can't allow our girls to continue to grow up having to have discussions with their mothers about whether or not they're going to be beaten, but how many times. So it's not a question for Indigenous women that they're going to be assaulted or raped or beaten or trafficked or murdered, but it's a question of when and how many times. And that is unacceptable. So I think the responsibilities legally and morally for governments to respond must happen now. We need the United Nations to step up, the Commission on Status of Women to step up and help us. We urge the Commission to engage with Indigenous women in deep and meaningful ways about not only how can we further understand the barriers that Indigenous women face worldwide, but what are some actual changes that different governments need to take now. So the more that governments talk about what must happen, the more we have women going missing and murdered and being assaulted and trafficked. And it's really not, it's preventable. We know it's preventable. We know it's preventable if Indigenous nations have the resources and the full authority to protect their women and children. Yet we know that governments stand in that way. So we ask for the UN Commission on the Status of Women's support for not just deeper engagements, but really figuring out some concrete action, because our women and children can't afford for us to continue to talk about this and not act. With that, I will turn it over back to Chris to see if there are any questions. But again, I just thank all of our speakers and thank all the participants and ask everyone to really engage in meaningful ways with your governments to hold them accountable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paula. We do have one question. I'm going to turn it back to Miranda to talk about, because it came in Portuguese. Do you want to? You want to pose that, or should we just leave it for them to respond by email? I'm not sure what the content of it is.
I will translate it really quick and read it out so that Kari and Chris have a moment to answer. I also know that Kari, Judith, also has to leave by 4, so I think that it'd be really important that I share this question. This is from our sister Claudia Canari. Kari and Chris, you talked about the various forms of male violence suffered by Indigenous women, especially during the pandemic in their communities, where they should feel safe. They are forced to spend more time with their attackers. I would like to know if there's an institution that accepts these types of complaints, and if there are any shelters or police stations exclusively for women in the northern states of the country of Brazil, and how they work, if at all, taking As an example, the case is underreported in the rest of the country. Thank you and congratulations for the excellent work.
Bom, posso falar já?
Please, go ahead.
Assim, primeiro é preciso fazer uma distinção. Nós, mulheres indígenas no Brasil, nós sofremos tanto violência por parte de membros internos da nossa comunidade, só que é muito menor. A maior parte da violência que nós sofremos são por invasores dos nossos territórios, madeireiros, garimpeiros, pessoas que querem fazer loteamento do território. Então, nós temos essas duas situações. Nem sempre o que é chamado de violência de gênero pela sociedade não indígena significa violência de gênero para nós, mulheres indígenas. E aquilo que nós dizemos que é violência de gênero não é compreendido como violência de gênero por muitos da sociedade não indígena. Em ambos os casos, não há um aparato específico para mulheres indígenas. Existem aldeias, e aí a Cris vai poder falar melhor, no estado do Amazonas, que elas chegam a custar 7 dias para chegar em uma cidade mais próxima, onde tem uma delegacia comum. E nessa delegacia não existe ninguém que fala a língua originária. Então, não existe um sistema de aparato específico para mulheres indígenas no Brasil, e o aparato geral que existe, delegacias gerais, secretarias gerais, elas não conseguem atender realmente a demanda da mulher indígena, seja pela distância, seja pela especificidade cultural, seja pelo idioma, seja N fatores que impedem a acessibilidade para as mulheres indígenas.
Exato, só complementando aqui o que a Carla já colocou, realmente é importante a gente dividir esses dois tipos de violência que a mulher indígena sofre, né? Tanto externo, de dentro da comunidade, como também dentro da comunidade, né? Justamente essas bem externas são já decorrentes de outros processos de invasão nas terras indígenas, né? Os garimpeiros, né? O desmatamento, né? Então, são esses tipos de violências que adentram a comunidade. E aí, realmente, a gente levando em consideração a situação do estado do Amazonas, comunidades, tem comunidades, por exemplo, tem comunidades que até 15 dias de barco para chegar numa cidade mais próxima, vamos dizer assim. Então, muitas vezes, esses tipos de violências elas ficam invisíveis dentro das comunidades indígenas, né? Porque elas não têm acesso a esses espaços que seria a delegacia, ou até o mesmo atendimento médico, pela distância dessas comunidades para o município mais próximo. Então, e aí, qual é outro ponto importante de se colocar? Muitas vezes, a violência dessas comunidades ela é em decorrência do oportunismo dentro dessas comunidades, né? Então, é importante sempre a gente dizer que a violência ela não faz parte do povo. Ela vem em decorrência de um colonialismo, né, europeu que veio para o Brasil, e aí trouxe essa ideia de que o homem é superior do que a mulher, né? E isso para a gente não existe. Sempre houve a paridade, a igualdade, né? E essa violência ela não faz parte de qualquer política, ela vem bem mais de dentro e fora para dentro das comunidades.
Very good. There is one more question here regarding sort of a question about how about human rights and the connection to the UN. And I'll go ahead and address that briefly because that was sort of that was part of what I intended to say at the very beginning of this event, and then I cut my comments off so that to make sure that we had enough time for everyone else to speak. But we do have a few more minutes here, so I'll go ahead and return to some of the comments that I planned to make. You know, violence against Indigenous women is a human rights crisis, and it has long been recognized as such by the UN and by the UN Commission on the Status of Women. Indigenous women suffer multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and higher forms of violence than other women. They're battered, raped, murdered, and disappear at extraordinary rates because of their gender, because they're women, and because they are indigenous. This happens in the United States. It happens in Brazil. It happens in Guatemala. It happens to indigenous women living all around the world. The UN Commission on the Status of Women knows this. Back in its 2013 agreed conclusions, the Commission noted that violence against women and girls persists in every country and is a form of discrimination that seriously violates and impairs or nullifies the enjoyment by women and girls of all human rights and fundamental freedoms. That's sort of the general statement by the Commission on violence against women. The Commission then specifically recognized that indigenous women often suffer multiple forms of discrimination and poverty, which increase their vulnerability to all forms of violence. It recommended that states ensure women's and girls' unimpeded access to justice, just and effective remedies, and urged states to end impunity by ensuring accountability and punishing perpetrators of the most serious crimes against women and girls. And then in 2017, in 2018, and 2019, the Commission went on to urge states to address the multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and barriers they face, including violence. So we know what the problem is, and the UN Commission understands the problem as well. And we do have this clear human rights framework to help us address this issue, to help us think through it, and to help us sort of identify legal resources that we can bring to bear in our domestic advocacy, sort of look at international standards as tools that we can use to pressure our governments, whether they're in Brazil or Guatemala or the United States or wherever, to adopt laws that comply with international standards, that meet the standards that our countries have variously promised to meet. So we have, the Beijing Declaration, obviously here at the UNCSW that we work with. There are the many human rights treaties and regional human rights treaties that various countries have adopted that are relevant. For us as Indigenous advocates, the thing that we look at the most is, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the leading statement of the global consensus about the minimum standards that are necessary for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples is how the Declaration phrases it. And the UN Declaration has a lot to say about violence against Indigenous women, and the presentations that we've gone through here today help draw that out. Most directly, the Declaration says that Indigenous women have the right to live a life free of all forms of violence and discrimination. So there's just this plain blanket statement right there. But then, as we've been driving and pulling out in these conversations today, there are these other elements, these other sets of rights that are recognized in the Declaration that are relevant here. There's land rights and there's self-government rights, and they both work together, or they can work together to ensure safety for Indigenous women. Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. In the UN Declaration, it's recognized. And as part of that self-determination right, we have certain self-government rights, including the right to autonomy in matters relating to internal and local affairs. We have the right to ways and means to finance our autonomous functions. The Declaration recognizes our right to maintain our juridical systems, our courts and legal systems, and our right to maintain and strengthen our legal and political structures. So all of that gets to the point that as Indigenous peoples, we have this collective right of self-government that includes a right to respond appropriately to crimes that are committed in our territories, including crimes of violence against Indigenous women. Secondly, we also have land rights that are recognized in the Declaration. We have the right to own, use, develop, and control our lands, territories, and resources. So we have the right to our lands, we have the right to self-government, and that includes the right to protect our citizens in our lands. And that's a lot of what we've been talking about. Obviously, Indigenous women live outside of our territory, our traditional territories too. And that's a bigger conversation, parts of which we've talked about in various ways, including the focus on immigration and migration that Juanita brought up. But these rights, they work together to protect and restore safety to Indigenous women. And it's the systematic violation of these rights by our various colonial governments that puts Indigenous women at risk. It's the practice of colonialism that seeks to dispossess us, to seize our lands, to seize our resources, to abolish or disempower our governments. And that is what leads to the crisis in gender-based violence that we now face. And that's kind of what so many of us have been talking about this morning, or this afternoon rather. So that's a little bit about the bigger sort of human rights framework of this issue. There is a lot to be said there, and I don't want to go too much further afield at this point. But just to say that the UN and the Commission on the Status of Women and the various human rights bodies have long recognized both that violence against Indigenous women is a human rights issue, as we all know, and the violence against Indigenous women is a more specific subset and brings us into questions about Indigenous rights and our Indigenous collective and rights, as well as our the individual rights that Indigenous women have to live lives free of violence. So a lot going on there, and I think that all of our organizations probably have a great deal of information on our websites that would be helpful. But this is something that Indian Law Resource Center works on quite a bit. So I encourage you to look at some of the things that we have, including in our in the files section of this this event page. We have a copy of the written submission that we sent to the CSW this year, and it kind of goes through this in a little bit more detail that might be helpful to you if you have questions about this. And also reach out to us and contact us. I know that I would be happy to talk with anyone or email with anyone or share more information. I think that everyone here today also welcomes. We're doing this to meet you. We wish we could do it in New York and meet you in person, but we're here on Zoom today instead, and that's good. A lot of people are here with us, and that's wonderful. And email us, look on our website, be in touch with us, share information, and we'll share information back. We're very glad to be here today, and we appreciate everyone who took time to come this morning or this afternoon, and to stick around in the early moments when we were having such difficulty with the platform. So I think that's all that we have to say today. And again, I would just like to thank everyone for coming, thanking our panelists especially, thanking Miranda for her work and the translators for their hard work, trying to keep up with all of us, including me, who speaks way too fast, I know, for all of the translators, and I apologize. But again, thank you all, and we wish you the best, and please be in touch if you have questions.